I'm here in Wellington, New Zealand, and my guest is Bob Rigg. Bob, it's lovely to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you for joining me tonight. Now, you've been a political activist for a large part of your life. Why don't you give us a little background on yourself?
Well, I was born in 1945, January 45, before the war had ended, of course. And so I grew up I grew up in terms of consciousness in the late 40s and early 50s. And I often wonder, I come from an extremely conservative, not reactionary, family background. And one of my favorite stories about my mother is her saying to me one day, you know, Robert, you live in a free country. You can talk about anything you like, except for sex, politics, and religion. And so we didn't talk about politics. We didn't talk about issues, really. I don't think we had a daily newspaper.
Really? Did you grow up in Wellington?
No. Well, my father was a civil servant, and to get promotion, he made himself infinitely ready to move town. So I had 3 or 4 primary schools and 3 secondary schools. I was always being dragged from one town and one school to another, which was actually, I was a very introspective, little socially inept little chap, as I have once described myself. And it was actually, it was extremely bad for me. I had my first friend when I was in my early to mid-20s.
Wow. Well, New Zealand at that time, I mean, it's such a remote country, obviously. It's as I walk around this city and even in Auckland, I wonder, what would it have been like 30, 40, 50 years ago? Well,
New Zealand was settled, first of course, when I was growing up, another theme actually is racism. When I was growing up, I was always told that New Zealand was discovered by an English sailor called Captain James Cook.
Right.
In 1769. This is the history that I learned at school. Now I know that at least 500-600 years before Captain James Cook, Maoris first arrived in New Zealand.
Right.
But at that time, this was unworthy of mention. It wasn't part of the national history. They were simply excluded from it. So I grew up with that too. So New Zealand was settled by, mainly I would say, by shopkeepers, lower middle class people, and then by farmers and peasants. And of course there was an elite, but they were numerically few. And my personal view is that this sort of what I call petty bourgeois thing has sort of, in a way, in certain ways, tainted our society. Because these were people who, you know, ran businesses, small business, shops and farms, worked with their hands, and they had no intellectual background, and they had no real interest in intellectual issues or political issues. So this I think still characterises New Zealand today. And this is why there's so little discussion of so many things. And as well as the overwhelming cultural influence of the English. Because this is my mother, don't talk about sex, politics or religion. You know, you must be polite. And my mother told me this too, never say or do anything that could offend another person. So as a little boy I thought about this and I acted on that. Mostly I never said anything. And the thought of offending someone else, you know, it's still in me actually. I have to fight it.
Right, right. Now, so you've also been involved in various diplomatic delegations and things like that, specifically with the abolition of chemical weapons?
Well, what I'll briefly say, by the way, then I began to get interested in politics, and initially I was not really interested in domestic politics. But I began to get interested in international relations. And for my generation, number one was Vietnam. But in my case, Chile.
Allende.
Allende. And that really kind of got to me. And at the time we had a progressive Labour government, progressive in inverted commas. But of course many of the and Chile had a lot of refugees. And there was pressure from the churches and the public to take in Chilean refugees.
Here in New Zealand.
Given what was happening in Chile. But the establishment, including in the Labour Party, the government of the time, who were being murdered and persecuted by the Chilean government? Communists and left-wingers. And they didn't want to import communism into the country.
I see.
Interesting. So the result was a kind of a deal which let in a few. And they were probably, this was never announced, but I'm sure they were probably screened quite carefully. But when they came to Hamilton, the city where I was then a university teacher, my best memory is that we decided to organise a big welcome party on a marae. That's a traditional Maori village. And so a lot of Maoris from the marae were there, and the Chileans came in. Well, it was fascinating, and I was there with a lot of white, liberal, young, radical friends. And the fascinating thing about the party was that the Chileans all arrived with their children, large and small. The Maoris did the same. Within 30 minutes, the Maoris and the Chileans were at the same end of the hall, really getting on famously with each other, while the white liberals kind of floated a bit just uncomfortably. So that was an interesting experience.
There was a Maori performance at Hillary Clinton's speech the other day. And is this a Maori necklace you're wearing?
Well, actually, it's not. It's carved by the man who's viewed as the leading bone carver in New Zealand. But he's what we call a pakeha. He's white, but he's a phenomenal bone carver. And I bought this as an object of art, just for sheer beauty, not because it means anything in particular.
Got it.
So yes, I was an academic. Then I eventually, for a while, I was executive director of Amnesty International in New Zealand.
Oh, wow.
For a few years. That was interesting too.
How so?
Well, what I learned, in those days, Amnesty was known because of what was referred to as letter writing. And the members of Amnesty International were encouraged to write letters to dictators all over the world. And
was it Pinochet that Amnesty started?
Well, it was Pinochet in Chile, but I mean, but already then, Mandela was in South Africa. But Amnesty had a special category of prisoner called prisoners of conscience. But to be a prisoner of conscience, you were not allowed to have advocated violence. And Mandela had advocated violence at one stage in his life. So he could never be a prisoner of conscience, which was actually very embarrassing for Amnesty, given that he was the best-known prisoner in the world. But what I learned, to my amazement, was, because from the outset I was a bit cynical, because I thought, well, if I'm a tin pot dictator, and my secretary brings me a rubbish bin full of letters, I just say, take them away and burn them. Don't even bother reading them.
Right.
But the myth was established, and it was a good way of recruiting members for the organisation. It was full of individuals who cared passionately about human rights abuses and prisoners, and who believed that if they wrote these letters in large numbers, it might actually help someone to get out of jail.
Did it?
No.
Never helped.
Well, if you're a dictator.
Why would you care about a letter?
Exactly. Or 100 or 1,000 letters.
And particularly even people who aren't in your country, what are they going to do?
That's right. So you collected stamps. You became a stamp collector. But what I discovered was that, so the question was, how was Amnesty so influential at the time? And
MTV?
No, not the media. What I found out was that in New Zealand, but this is how Amnesty works, or did work then, we worked through the government. So the key dimension of my job, apart from motivating the membership and all that, and raising money and all those things, was basically building really close relationships with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the government. We had an Amnesty group in Parliament. And so I'll just tell you one story from the end of my Amnesty career. It was my last day, my last week. London had approached us, our headquarters, and they said, this is top secret. We couldn't go public because we couldn't prove anything. But since 1965 in Indonesia, when hundreds of thousands were murdered by the Indonesian government, with the collaboration of the Americans, by the way, your peace-loving people, those who weren't killed or murdered were just jailed without trial or charge. And they'd been in jail, festering in jails in Indonesia for 30 or 40 years at that stage.
Political dissidents, or
That's
why
right.
was this happening?
Well, no, they weren't even dissidents. I mean, they were just people. There was a mass murder. and just, certain the security forces went around basically lynching anybody who just got in their way, who they thought deserved to be lynched. It was,
Never heard about this.
they ran amok. All Americans should know about it.
What was America's purpose in doing that?
The commies. They thought that the president of Indonesia at that time was sympathetic to the commies, and that the communists could establish a toehold in Indonesia, which they didn't want, so he had to go.
Yeah, and is it Duarte now? Is he the?
No. That's the Philippines. This was
sorry,
Indonesia.
right.
Yeah. So London approached me, but it was also approaching other amnesty groups all around in Indonesia, in the region. And they said, look, we can't go publish on this because we can't prove anything. But we know so much about the conditions in these prisons and how they treat the prisoners. So they said, what's happened is that 4 prisoners who we know of have been suddenly, without any reason being given, removed from their cells. And we know from experience that once they're removed from their cells, they tend to get shot. But we simply can't prove this, so we can't go to the media. So this was late on a Friday afternoon. So what we want you to do is to basically approach your Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Cabinet, of the government, and get Cabinet ministers to approach the opposite numbers in Indonesia, and get the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to lobby the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Indonesia. So I started work, and then I thought, shit, it's Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, and in New Zealand, almost all the MPs are either drunk in the bar in Parliament, or they're on the way back home to their home electorates.
Right.
So I sat up all night, but by the Saturday morning, more than half members of the Cabinet had sent telexes to their opposite numbers in Indonesia. And then 5 days later was my last day with Amnesty. And I went over to the ministry to say goodbye to some of the people who I really liked. And one of them, a lawyer called Rigg, rushed to see me and said, Bob, they've been returned to their cells.
Oh, that's good.
So that was
a win?
Yeah, that was a win.
The rare win. So talk to me a bit about your involvement with the organization what is it?
For the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
Right.
Actually, because of my involvement in Amnesty, I got to know a diplomat, a senior diplomat. And when I and my wife went to live in the Netherlands, in The Hague, she was there, and one day she rang me up and said, there's a vacancy, an important vacancy in this United Nations organization, which I'd never heard of. And again, an American had been the senior editor. But she said there was some kind of political falling out within the organization. And he suddenly left 4 weeks before a major international meeting.
I see.
And they're wetting themselves, because without an editor, you can't have a major international meeting. So she said, I told them, but you can do it. I had never been an editor in my life before. So I joined, and of course, I had to work 26 hours a day for about 6 weeks. I had just to learn so much. I didn't know a thing about chemical weapons. I didn't know anything about the organisation. They even requested me, instructed me to write the Secretary General's personal report to the organisation, the annual report. Mm-hmm. And when I said, I've been here 2 days, how can I do that? His assistant said, do it, and walked out. It was a very supportive working environment.
Trial by fire.
That's right. Anyway, I survived. In fact, I did quite well, and ended up staying there for 10 years. And then, this is the bit I know that you're hot about.
Yes, the interaction with John Bolton.
We had a new Director General called Bustani, Jose Bustani from Brazil. Mm-hmm. And he was very direct and very honest. And in the world of diplomacy, these are characteristics that are rare, almost non-existent. But I enjoyed working with him. He was a very good boss. And although his native language was not English, he had a good eye for English, for bullshit. And the UN organisations are full of bullshit. First of all, of course, most of the staff are not native speakers of English. And secondly, the literary standards are often appalling.
Right.
Plus, we had a lot of scientists on the staff, and these were brilliant. I mean, world's top chemists, really brilliant men.
Right, for chemical weapons, of course.
But some of them can't write for nuts. They can write chemical equations that are 2 pages long. but they can't write, you know, a coherent two-line sentence.
Wow.
But anyway, but the point is, it was an interesting work environment. So Bostani is there, and he's direct and honest, and after 3 years, he was reappointed by acclamation, unanimously by all member states, and then about a year after that, at the time, strange things began to happen. Essentially,
When was this exactly?
this was about 2001, 2002.
Okay.
And then, so essentially, the US delegations, which had been very happy with Bostani, suddenly started to attack him, stab him on the back, and lobby against him within the organisation. And there was increasing tension, political tension, but no one at the time knew why, except, of course, it turns out, the Americans. And then one day I was at a dinner party with Bostani and his wife, and with his Russian special advisor, and with his Russian director of external relations. And this man's name was Sergei Batsanov. And Sergei's mobile phone rang. And he said, "Da," which means something like yes, I think, in Russian. And so he went to the side of the room, and he came back, and basically one of his old American friends, who I knew quite well, by the way, he was a right-wing Republican, and he'd worked with US intelligence for his whole life. But I knew him personally, and actually rather liked him, and we got on professionally very well together. And he said, Ron called me, and he said, we're going to take out Bostani. Leave town for a month or 6 weeks. And he left town the next day, flew to Geneva, where the Russian embassy found a doctor who said that he was ill, when he wasn't, but it meant he was there on full pay, with all the perks. And within a month, Bostani was sacked. And
he was fired, not killed.
No. Yeah.
Because why'd they tell him to leave town? Sounds like they're going to assassinate the guy.
Well, this is where John Bolton comes in.
Okay.
Because at that stage, John Bolton was the Under Secretary of State.
Right, under George W.
Under
Bush.
George Jr.
Right.
And, well, essentially first of all, you can't terminate in the UN system. If you have a Director General, or any member of staff, no matter who you want to, or no, at a lower level you can actually sack people. But at that high level, it almost never happens that anyone's sacked. I mean, the UN is full of incompetence, you know, at all levels, including right at the top. Not always. I mean, there are some very good people in the UN.
Right.
But they're as rare as hen's teeth.
Right. Well, I mean, imagine any dense bureaucracy like that is ripe with incompetence.
Well, also, what you've got to understand is also, because my organisation was a disarmament organisation, the place was full of people with a background in intelligence.
Why is that?
Well, because weapons of mass destruction are involved, and also the member states submit declarations to the organisation in which they tell you where all their chemical weapons are, and where they're produced and how they're produced. They're required to do that by the convention. And of course, you know, certain states would like to get their hands on that information about other states are doing.
And where the weapons are, where
all the works, everything. They're in theory they have to disclose everything.
Wow, interesting.
So these declarations are very important, and also the other thing was when we conduct inspections, our inspectors they have to go to all the chemical plants in the world to verify that they're not siphoning off chemicals for use to produce chemical weapons.
Okay.
They have to verify that. But of course, this means the chemical industry worldwide is very lucrative, big business. And of course, they're always developing new, not for warfare purposes, but they're always developing new chemicals for one purpose or another. But to inspect a production facility, you know, our inspectors have got to be introduced to pretty sort of secret areas.
Okay.
And big business is afraid that their everyday chemical secrets will be spilled.
Sort of industrial espionage is another problem as well.
So of course, when our people go and they screen off certain parts of a plant and take us to the chemicals that could be used to produce chemical weapons and so on. All this material is very sensitive. But I mean, a lot of the staff, on one occasion I was on an appointments panel, and several of the staff actually mentioned in their CVs that they'd worked for the military intelligence or, I mean, the place was stacked with spies. And the spies, of course, are reporting back to their delegations.
Right.
The place leaks like a sieve, although there's all this talk about confidentiality. There's no such thing. So the place leaks like a sieve. What became clear was that the US delegation had fallen out with Bustani, and then I was at this dinner party that I referred to earlier, and Batsano's phone rang and he said, I'm going to leave town for a month. And within a few days, within about a week or two, John Bolton was in town, and he came to Bustani, and basically it was a very short interview. He just sat down and said, I want you to resign by midnight today. And Bustani said, up you. And Bolton then leapt up from his chair, enraged, and shouted, now we'll do it my way, and walked over the door, slamming it madly, loudly behind himself.
Sounds crazy.
No, but this is not unusual in the UN system, such performances. So then it went to, Bustani couldn't be fired by the staff. He couldn't fire himself. It had to go to the Conference of the States Parties. Well, that being of the Executive Council, a sort of junior decision-making body, and then it goes to something called the Conference of the States Parties, which had to decide. And at both the conference meeting and also at the session of the council, something like 35 or 40% of all member states, when it came to a vote, abstained. But
obviously.
But in the UN, again, this is typical of the UN. In the UN, you don't dare to say no. It's undiplomatic.
Wow.
You say I abstain.
Well, it becomes the same thing essentially, doesn't it?
No, because if you say no to the United States, amongst other things, you might get it in the neck, or your government might get it in the neck. This is the point. So these considerations are always there.
John Bolton slams the door,
yeah,
and then
John
you
Bolton
do it his way.
Yes, yep. So, but Bustani was sacked.
And so how do you feel about John Bolton now being added to Donald Trump's cabinet?
If you look at Trump, Bolton, Pompeo, well, I've written an article about this recently, by the way. Amongst other things, I wrote that this is the first reactionary cabinet in the history of the United States of America.
Where can people see that article?
It's about to be published.
Okay.
If you'd like, I'll get Hugh to send it to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've also written something, by the way, about the Skripal incident in the United States.
Let's talk about that, the Novichok gas that the British government was so quick to assign to Russia. But I don't know if you've seen any of my interviews with David Hawkins, but he talks quite a bit about how that gas is manufactured in Portondown and also at the Northwestern University in Chicago. What's your take on that situation?
Well, but the obvious point is that, actually in my article, which I wrote on the subject, I said if Jeremy Corbyn today alleged that he'd been sexually harassed by Theresa May, there'd be a huge stink. But then, in the British way, they would set up an inquiry,
Right.
an independent inquiry. They hear arguments and evidence from both sides, and then they decide, and the process that would take 2 or 3 months or longer. A chemical agent is allegedly used in Syria, within 2 or 3 days, the UK, the US, and France all knew with absolute certainty.
And no inquiry.
There was no investigation, no inquiry, no samples taken, no evidence collected, no witnesses interviewed.
Sort of obvious that it's nonsense, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. So it was just weight of numbers and screaming from rooftops. And so it just, there was nothing resembling a fair process.
Doesn't it also seem counterproductive? I mean, obviously they would just say, oh, Bashar Assad is a madman, but even if he is, doesn't he know that using those chemical weapons would basically assure?
Well, no, that's the point. I mean, Assad, for the last 2 years, early in the war, it was clear that Assad was on the brink of losing. But then, basically, Iran and Russia came to the aid of Syria, and suddenly Assad couldn't lose under the circumstances. You know, he had such powerful backing, politically and militarily. So things were looking rosy for him, and it was precisely at that point that Syria allegedly started using chemical weapons.
Right.
Which drew, you know, the ire of the entire international community down its head. It simply didn't make sense.
Right. Well, yeah. It seems so obvious when you discuss it in this way that it's, you know, I mean, they just can't come up with any new ideas. They just have a standard line that they can roll out in the news, and they say, oh, look at these children with the chemical and this fake video. And
but also what's shocking is, by the way, what's doubly shocking is that it's exactly the same scenario as for Iraq. Exactly.
Yeah, weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. And,
so
and
Assad
completely
must be scared.
Completely false information.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sad. And we see this technique all the time.
Yeah.
Someone just makes up a false story. I mean, even in the case of the story they've brought to try to oust Donald Trump with Russian collusion and prostitutes urinating on a bed, they just make up whatever they want, push that story so they can have a pretext. So there was one thing that Hugh Stedman was telling me earlier today where Mr. Bolton actually threatened the... Yeah. What do you know about that?
Well, I know Jose contacted me actually recently about this. Bolton said to him that you know, he should take care of his children. They were quite young at the time. Something threatening like that. Jose, we were already then friends. Jose told me about it, and one or two other staff members, and we've all corroborated that. But I mean, the stories I've told you, it just shows what sort of person he is.
Well, it's thug tactics, isn't it?
Yeah, and of course I know a lot more about him now than I did then. I mean, he is simply a thug and a bully, and but of course I read a lot about his career. In the State Department, he was notorious for asking for an opinion on something, and a paper would come through saying, you know, white is white and black is black is black, and he would say, no, I want black to be white and white to be black, and he would instruct them to change to adjust their professional input.
And do you think his involvement in Trump's cabinet will lead to war in Iran?
Well, I personally think, my personal theory is that Trump is, throughout, I followed the election campaign extremely closely. And whenever Trump speaks about Iran, there's a particular malevolence in his voice, and a really mean, nasty, vicious tone.
He does seem ready to destroy it.
And of course, what I now know, in my most recent article, or one of them, recently I discovered, because at the time I thought, well, how can this Bolton man be so influential?
Yeah.
He was under secretary.
Yeah.
He's throwing his weight around quite a bit. In the meantime, when I was researching my most recent article, I stumbled across something called the Gatestone Institute. Have you heard of the Gatestone Institute?
I can't say that I have.
It's the creature of a very wealthy and powerful Zionist woman called Nina Rosenfeld, who's filthy rich. And its chairman has been John Bolton, and all Sheldon Adelson, all the key players are there, including Larry Ellison, who, when I did my research, because in New Zealand we know Larry Ellison as a yachty.
A yachty, meaning he has a yacht?
No, he a very big ocean-going yacht.
One of the biggest in the world,
internationally. Yeah, that's right. But it turns out that he and his dad didn't like to be known as Jewish, so they changed their name.
Wait, Larry Ellison?
Yeah.
Really?
So So
I didn't realize that he was Jewish.
yeah, no, I didn't either. Well, you're not meant to. But so the interesting thing is that all of these people who happen to be Jewish and who are up to their necks in Zionism, and Adelson, for example, has Trump's personal telephone number.
Well, I went to a Donald Trump rally in Las Vegas at the Venetian, and Donald Trump mentioned, I think Sheldon is his first
Sheldon,
name?
yeah.
Adelson, yeah.
Well, Sheldon Adelson gave $35 million to Trump's election campaign. He gave $2 to John Bolton's campaign.
$2?
Yeah, $2 million.
Oh, $2 million. Yeah, that's better.
So essentially, this group
Working for him.
very focused Zionists with enormous amounts of money have been working for years in collaboration with Netanyahu to promote the interests of Israel, and they're now in a position where, well, that's the point. John Bolton is their man.
Right. So they said put him in.
Well,
Very probable.
Well, without their support, he might not have made it. Put it this way, and it's quite probable that because of their support, he became Under Secretary of State under Bush in the first place.
Wow.
Because what I'm pointing out in my article is that, for example, another very wealthy magnate, Robert Mercer,
Oh, yeah.
he would, I'm sure that like everybody else, you've heard of Cambridge Analytica.
Yes.
Robert Mercer owns that.
Wow.
Robert Mercer recommended Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway for the White House. I mean, this is how powerful these people are. Robert Mercer put up $10 million for what's the name of his alternative?
Breitbart?
Yeah, Breitbart.
Yeah,
So
I
he funded
remember that.
Breitbart.
Yeah.
And so I think you'll find my article interesting reading, because when you look, and then of course I didn't, by the way, just look at Jewish magnates. I also looked at how do you pronounce it in the States? The correct German pronunciation would be the Koch brothers.
Yeah. Koch brothers.
Koch, okay, the Koch brothers. They, in the 2016 midterm elections, I think they put up $886 million for Conservative candidates. So, towards the end of my article, I say, the US is not a democracy; it's a banana republic.
Right. And we've been hearing a lot lately about the Clinton Foundation and how New Zealand taxpayers' money has been going towards the Clinton Foundation. Were you surprised when John Key resigned so abruptly after the election?
No.
He was well liked, wasn't
he? Oh, he was a very successful politician.
Did you like him?
No, I didn't. but
Why not? Affiliation with the Clintons?
I'm not a conservative.
Right.
And he wasn't hard right in the American sense, actually.
Why would such a right-wing guy get with the Clintons? Money?
Oh no, well he's a millionaire in his own right. So money's of no consequence to him. The first thing he did when he stood down as Prime Minister was to buy himself a Bentley.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think millionaires want to be billionaires, don't they?
Not in New Zealand, no.
No.
This is not the United States, fortunately.
But it does seem there's all these things happening where the United States has great influence over New Zealand. Of course, you know of Harmon Wilford, right? What are your thoughts on Harmon's situation?
I honestly, clearly it seems to me it's extremely unjust and unfair. But I cannot pretend to know nearly as much as you. Okay, I would. So I would not be. Well, I would not be able, with good conscience, to discuss that in any depth.
Right. Okay. No problem. So, where are you feeling the United States is going with Donald Trump as president? And I mean, you have expressed to me outside of this conversation that you're not a fan of Hillary Clinton.
No, I'm not.
So.
Well, first of all, I'll talk about Trump. I think that, first of all, Trump's political alignment has changed since he became president. He's a showman, and initially he wanted to be loved by everybody. But he had to discover that you know, he was on the right. He had been a Democrat, you know, as we all know.
Yeah.
But he was standing as president for the Republican Party, so he had no choice but to pose as a Republican. But once he joined the Republican Party, he discovered that the elite of the party often didn't like him, couldn't stand him. But he discovered that the general public, his base, adored him. And if he tossed them lots of red meat, the more red meat he tossed them, the more they loved him. And if he tossed red meat, he had to offer them something. So he began to drift further and further to the right without really knowing what he was doing. He's not an intellectual, he doesn't think about things. He just responds spontaneously to these situations. And now now essentially he's a hard right candidate. And that's what appeals to his base. These inflammatory speeches, you know, where he attacks immigrants and Muslims and, you know, and abuses people who are crippled.
Well,
Yeah.
I think some of that was misreported, but do you think he's making progress with North Korea?
Well, the first thing I'd challenge about that question is, of course, this is how the Americans see things. Well, you know, because of Donald, you know, we might have peace in Korea. Just sit back for a moment. Who has done all the donkey work, the hard grind?
Dennis Rodman?
South Korea.
Oh.
The South Korean government.
Yeah.
And they arranged the Olympics. They very carefully choreographed things so that there were encounters during the Olympics. Mm-hmm. Many of them secret, I'm sure, and confidential. But also, you know, the North Korean leader's sister was there and got huge publicity, right. Far more than Ivanka.
Sitting next to Pence or something.
That's right. And Pence nearly spat at him. Because at that stage the US line, that's the point. At that stage,
who spat at who?
Pence, you know, stared like this at her, you know. And when there were opportunities for him just to sort of kind of shake the hand,
right.
You know, the sister of another head of state, he just ignored her and sailed past. So at that stage, the Trump elite wanted a fight with North Korea. But, you know, they wanted to try out their new technology and all that kind of stuff. Mm. And we destroyed North Korea, and after World War II, it's about time we did it again. So that line for the time being has disappeared. But what worries me is that, again, Bolton is the key player here, because there are so many different things being said by so many different players. It becomes confusing. Mm. But Bolton knows what he's doing. And what he has said more than once, I've seen it on telly, he said, we're not interested in words. In other words, we're not just going to sign an agreement and, you know, and shake hands, make peace. Right. Because we believe that you know, may not be very sincere. And by the way, he's quite right in that. The North Koreans have played that game before.
Notorious.
They've made promises and then not, you know, lived up to them.
Right.
So, but what he has said, and he knows disarmament, and he knows the language of disarmament. What he has said is, only when we can see that the nuclear program is being dismantled, and that is verifiable and irreversible. This is a classic word from the Chemical Weapons Convention, for example. And only when we see it's verifiable and that it's being dismantled, you know, do we really have a business deal. Now, the North Koreans are never going to agree to the dismantling of any of their nuclear arsenal.
Why do you say that?
Because
they look at Libya, they look at Iraq.
No. Well, the basic what have they been doing over the years? Because they didn't trust the US, and the US is somewhat bigger and more powerful than they are. They decided that the only way for them to protect themselves against attempts at regime change was to have nukes. And in the context of Iraq and Libya, they know. Well, they look at Saddam.
Yeah.
They hung him. His head fell off when they hung him, by the way. And did you know that when Gaddafi was murdered, they shoved a bayonet up his bum?
Yeah.
He died rather painfully. And if I was Kim, I wouldn't want that to happen to me. So the Americans don't trust, with some justice, the North Koreans, but with more justice, the North Koreans don't trust the Americans. And as we see in the case of Libya and Iraq. So, but the key thing is, as soon as Bolton finds out that the North Koreans are not willing to dismantle their own program, verifiably and irreversibly, I think that'll be the end of the negotiations. And also at that point, Trump being the sort of idiot that he is, Trump will suddenly, because now, by the way, Trump, he's preening himself because he and his family believe that he will win the next Nobel Peace Prize.
But they have been nominated or no?
No, that will come. And at a recent Trump public meeting, the crowd of Trump supporters were chanting that he should get the Nobel Prize.
Wow.
So, and of course this appeals to his vanity and all that. So if the negotiations fall through, Trump's vanity will be seriously dented, and he will suddenly not be interested in be friendly anymore. He'll be enraged,
Vindictive,
and he'll want to go after the North Koreans to make them pay for conning him.
So it sounds like you don't have a very positive view of the future for America.
No, I don't. I mean, if you look at that, I'm a foreigner. If I grew up in the
Well,
50s.
in this context, I'm a foreigner.
Right. Okay.
We're here in your country.
Yeah. I grew up in the 50s with all this, hearing and believing all this stuff about what a wonderful society it was, how advanced it was technologically, blah blah blah.
About the U.S. you
Yeah.
mean?
But I've been there. And I mean, your cities. If you look at American cities and then travel around Europe, public transport, infrastructure. I lived for 10 years in Holland.
Yeah.
They seem to renew the sewers, for example, about once every 2 years.
In Holland.
Yeah, I mean they're renewing infrastructure. They've got wonderful trains, good education, good public health.
Yeah. So what is it, you think, in America? Is it just so much corruption? Is it?
No, but what's at the root of the corruption?
Tell me.
And my personal theory is you've got to go back to the 19th century. Essentially, I think that we were talking just before about the extraordinary importance of enormously rich individuals. Mm-hmm. And if you think back to the 19th century, that's always been the case in the United States. The railway barons and all this.
Yeah.
And I forget which one I saw a movie once about one of them at the time. I think it was the Rockefellers. One day a year, they had a dinner. They had a tea party for their dogs, and I saw all these carriages rolling into the Rockefellers' estate with these, little doggies sort of sitting up. But I mean, in my article about democracy in the US, I say it's like the Maharajas and Nabobs of old India. Mm-hmm. And if you add to the rich and the filthy rich individuals, the enormously powerful corporations, the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
I mean, ordinary citizens just have no say, have no voice in what really happens, what really makes decisions happen. I once visited Congress. I was in Washington, and I was staying with a woman who was with a peace group, and her group had a meeting with a very senior Democratic senator. So I actually walked through the corridors of that place, and I mean, you can just smell privilege, wealth, and if there are blacks, they're normally in subordinate positions, and there are very few Latinos actually. And of course, if I watch television, I mean, there are always elderly, fat, overweight, gross white men who we are discovering, who are devout Christians, but who feel up every woman they come across.
Well, I don't think that's universally true.
Well, I mean, that's an exaggeration. But what I mean is this. Well, who is there in your Congress who actually inspires a degree of trust and confidence in you that
I think Louis Gohmert is doing a good job. I think there's a lot of guys that are speaking out now that we've got the Inspector General's report coming. Devin Nunes has been doing a lot of good things.
You think he has, Nunes?
You don't think so?
Well, I thought he was a lapdog. I'm inclined to think he's a lapdog of the Republican Party. He just appears on committees and he's on Fox, and he's their mouthpiece.
I think so. I don't necessarily disagree with the things that you've said about John Bolton and some of Donald Trump's reactionary responses to things. I am also concerned about the future and what it'll hold. And I did not like it that Donald Trump launched missiles into Syria when there was no investigation into this gas attack. And certainly, when you're given this binary decision of Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, I mean, there's just so much that I know about the Clintons and Hillary Clinton that make it impossible for me to accept voting for her, that it does to some extent become this lesser of two evils thing. But I was and remain very hopeful that Donald Trump's presidency will be successful and that hopefully this North Korean deal will turn into something good. It is a cause.
Yeah. If they pull up a deal, it will be good, of course. But I just think it's highly unlikely for the reasons that I've outlined.
Yeah. Well,
to quote John Bolton, I'll believe in it when I see your arsenal being dismantled, and I will see that the process is verifiable and irreversible.
Yeah.
Now, if the US adheres to that position, there will never be a deal. But again, Trump, of course, is the president, and you can tell his vanity is so tickled, prospect of getting a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
Who knows what principles he might be willing to sacrifice to get the Nobel Peace Prize.
Do you think Donald Trump has done anything that's good?
No.
Well, not at all.
No. I think it's a disaster.
Really?
For the United States and for the world.
Really?
He is the way in which he governs. The US is still the most powerful country in the world and influential. First of all, I think the concept of democracy has been devalued.
Well, I think it's been virtually eliminated.
That's right, and there's the perception is there that in the US, government lacks integrity. And if you look at the way
that's quite clear.
But these two findings alone are devastating for the US. Internationally, the US is viewed as either a joke or an embarrassment.
Huh. And has there been much reporting here in New Zealand about the problems going on with the FBI and the corruption within there?
Well, I watch a lot of American TV, and because of course you can get a lot of American channels on cable. Right. And I have to confess, by the way, that I watch a lot of Fox. And I thought you might look surprised, but you didn't.
Well, I mean, I would imagine you strike me as the kind of guy who probably evaluates a lot of different viewpoints.
Yeah. No, that's why. But also, if you want to understand the right, and if you want to understand Trump, you must watch Fox. Because, I write about this in my article too, because if you watch, the key players, people like Hannity, Tucker Carlson. In the case of Hannity always prefaces his nightly program with what he grandly calls an opening monologue. If you read Trump's tweets the next morning, he often uses phrases or words out of Hannity's opening monologue. Sometimes when I'm watching Fox, just junior Foxes, seriously, they know the president watches Fox almost all day long. He does watch other channels. So occasionally, I've seen it more than once, they look up into the camera and say, if the president's watching this, he might just find it very useful. So the Fourth Estate is counselling, advising the President of the United States. Well, and Fox is owned by Rupert Murdoch. Right. And Fox makes a profit of $1 billion a year. Wow. And Hannity earns $37 million a year.
Wow. Yeah, it's all quite shocking, and it's
And so you raised the question of Clinton, by the way, and that's the link. I mean, that kind of corruption is the same. And the Clintons are, well, if you look at the history of the Democratic Party in recent decades, it's these dynasties, filthy, rich dynasties that have always run the party. The party pretended to represent ordinary, reasonably
Definitely not.
poor, ordinary folk. But in reality, it was completely dominated by these elites. And Bill Clinton moved the party to the right, and that's the split. And so Hillary, and this is, in my view, this cost the Democrats the election.
What did?
If Hillary, Bernie Sanders gave her a fright. He came close to winning. And it was clear, by the way, that he was extremely appealing to a section of the electorate which she did not appeal to, young people, students. They came out in droves. If she had appointed him as her running mate, her vice presidential running mate, she would have rolled him.
I thought for a minute when they came on stage and she launched that Stronger Together that she was going to say Bernie Sanders vice president. And when I thought that, I thought I was very torn because I supported Bernie Sanders. But I've come to understand that actually Bernie Sanders knew things prior to the debates that he didn't share. He knew that Boeing and General Electric had these missing emails when he gave that famous, nobody cares about your damn emails. So he kind of threw the fight. I've come to believe that it's possible that Bernie Sanders was, a player in this game and he played his role and he left, and there was no way he was ever going to win.
Maybe you're right.
Don't know.
Well, no, it wasn't because we won. What I'm contending is that it was clear he was enormously attractive to young voters throughout the states. They turned out in droves. They were disciples, almost religious fervour. But she was so convinced that she could win without him that she dispensed with him. But if she'd taken him on board, it would have added hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of votes.
I think it would have been the tipping point for sure.
That's right.
It's very confusing to me that she didn't do that. It seems
because she's on the right, and she is, she will not allow someone.
Well, she's a neocon, basically, right?
Yeah, and she would not allow someone like, if she, from her point of view, because this would have been true, by the way, if he had been vice president, they would have spent a lot of their time arguing and fighting. But at the same time, in politics, it's not unusual for two people whose views differ to get together in a government. They sit down at the beginning of the process and work out what they can agree on and proceed on that basis. That can happen, and they could have done it.
Do you feel like the United States has too much influence over New Zealand?
Well, yes, but I mean, the problem with New Zealand is we're a little country. We're remote from the rest of the world, and some New Zealanders, by the way, find this intimidating. And we're alone down here, apart from Australia, the only civilized white nation amidst a sea of, people, of non-white people, of dubious degree of civilization. So the result is we feel quite vulnerable. And because we're such a small country, we've got nothing resembling a military.
So you guys sort of need this Five Eyes relationship.
So that's right. So, but until after World War II, we attached our wagon to the United Kingdom.
Right.
But when the United Kingdom, at the end of the war, was financially so crippled that it had to abandon its entire empire, they abandoned us, and we just had to attach ourselves to the next wagon in town. That was the United States.
It's interesting. I mean, being in the United States, I mean, obviously I've only been in New Zealand a couple of days, but just talking to you and other people and being here and seeing the city and everything, that's a unique position to be in. New Zealand is vulnerable in that way, financially and militarily, and natural disasters like the earthquakes and things like that.
It's also, of course, quite racist.
New Zealand is?
Oh, no, this thing about Asia. In my primary school, this again was the 50s, I remember the name of this teacher, his was Mr. Smith. And we were having social studies. And one day he was talking to us about the war, I guess, and he said, I never forgot it, if it hadn't been for the Battle of the Coral Sea, you would all be half Japanese by now.
Wow.
And that's
Strange comment.
The yellow peril. That's no, at the time it was normal. And I think in Australia, by the way, it's especially marked, because if you look at the map of the world, you see Southeast Asia, and then you see Indonesia with thousands of islands, literally, and you can paddle in a canoe from Indonesia to Australia, to northern Australia.
Your arms would be pretty tired.
That's
after
right.
that.
So the Australians feel that's in their history, that's been a real sense of vulnerability.
Well, Bob, we've been speaking for about an hour, and I'm sure we could go on and on, but it's getting kind of late, and my jet lag is kind of still not fully out of me. Is there anything you want to share with the audience before we close it out for tonight?
I've met a lot of very nice Americans who I respect enormously and like. But I feel that people like that don't tend to find their way into places where decisions are made. The system somehow excludes them. And I think that's this boils down to democracy. So, for example, if you think of Jacinda Ardern, our Prime Minister, she grew up in a small country village, more or less. Her parents have got no money, they owned a small farm, they're not important or highly educated. She worked for a living when she was at school. She worked in shops and things on the weekend. Went to university, got a reasonably ordinary degree, but it turns out throughout her life she'd really been politically aware. And she joined the Labour Party, and then there was a fortuitous combination of circumstances which led to her being suddenly, unexpectedly appointed candidate and becoming Prime Minister. And she's 37 and she's pregnant. Something like that could not happen in the States. You'd have to agree.
Oh, I do agree.
Yeah,
An unmarried pregnant woman would be, I think, virtually unelectable in the United States.
But also not backed by big money and all these things, and the power.
Why do you suppose that it worked here in New Zealand?
Because we're sort of a relatively undeveloped society. It's just, and it is true that there's sort of an egalitarian tendency in New Zealand which doesn't exist in the US. I mean, the US society is incredibly highly hierarchical. Everybody, elites dominate, control everything, everywhere.
Right.
And also they display their wealth so ostentatiously. They rub it on everybody's noses.
Well, one of the things I noticed when I came into Wellington here, the first building I saw was a Masonic lodge, and all the tall skyscrapers are Deloitte and Citibank, and all the corporations and all of the powerful secret societies and whatever it is, the elites, the Illuminati, whatever you want to call it. They're here just like they're everywhere.
Yeah. But socially, you haven't been here very long, but one big difference between New Zealand and other places where I've lived, Germany, Holland, like Holland, for example, is a country I really liked living in.
Yeah.
And I could happily go back to live there. But Holland is socially very stratified.
Yeah.
I mean, it's subtle, so they don't go around in the American way, rubbing other people's noses into their wealth. In fact, they're very discreet about it. If you've got a lot of money, you drive a small car, you fit in. But in New Zealand, socially, you go to the pub, you can find yourself talking to the managing director of a multinational corporation, and it's first name terms immediately, and
people have definitely been very friendly, for sure.
That's something special that I like.
And I've discovered that the old Zealand is in Holland, so perhaps
that's right.
that's
That's right.
Well, Bob, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. My guest tonight has been Bob Rigg. And where will people be able to see that article that you've written?
I'll send it to you.
You'll send it to me, and then I can attach it to the comments in this video when it comes.
I'll send you two, actually, because I'll send you the one about democracy in the US, or the lack of it, and I'll also send you the one about chemical weapons in Syria.
Yes, very good. I'll be interested to see that,
Can you
Bob.
give me a card?
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you.
Great speaking with you.
Looking forward to a nice Indian meal and a bottle of wine.
There you go. Very good. Thank you.